Hello and welcome to the Safety Goals podcast with Justin Torres and Charlie Wund, presented by InjureFree. This is episode 8 with our special guest, Marty McNair.
Justin, Marty McNair is one of those guys you come across in sports who has an incredible background and has endured probably the worst tragedy that any parent could ever go through in the loss of a child. But his story started long before that, and it's exciting to hear where he is in his life now, what lessons he has to share for the rest of us, and just an absolute wealth of experience. And so, real pleasure to be able to sit down with Marty, and hopefully our listeners enjoy hearing some of his journey through life as well.
Absolutely. I mean, Charlie, for me, I remember sitting in front of the TV in 2018 hearing all about Martin's family story with his son Jordan and what happened over in Maryland. And to think that, 5 years removed, I'd be talking to his father about this exact incident. It's not something I thought of, but it was truly a great honor to speak with him. He had a great story, like you said, and I'm really excited for all of our listeners to hear what he had to say. So without further ado, let's get into the show. Okay, so we are here with Martin McNair of the Jordan McNair Foundation. Martin, it's a pleasure to have you on. Charlie and I have been trying to get this to work for quite some time. And for anyone that doesn't know you, I was just hoping that you could kind of give a bit of your background, where you grew up, a little bit of your early life, and how you either found a passion for sports or how you got involved in it.
Yeah, so Justin, let me correct you. Most people know me as Marty McNair versus Martin McNair in a sense. So yeah, man, I'm the founder of the Jordan McNair Foundation. A lot of people, if you're in the sports space or the sports world, obviously you should know our story. Jordan had a heat stroke back in 2018, very first day of conditioning drills, and man, it was like literally life changing at the point. We got a phone call on May 28th of 2018. And it was just basically from a campus police officer, University of Maryland campus police officer. And he basically said Jordan had a seizure on. He said it's been an incident on the field. Jordan had a seizure. And at this time, Jordan was 6'5", 300 plus pounds, a size 16 shoe. He had never been in a hospital literally from the time, probably when he was born, of course, and that was it. So this was really, really foreign to us, just in regards to, what could have possibly happened. When I came out, I was basically en route to grab Jordan's mom, Tanya, to go to the hospital, but I'm really not the panic button pusher type. So I'm the guy that likes to get there, assess the situation, then, make my decision on what happened or where are we at that point. But up until this point, basically I'm a guy from Baltimore, Maryland. Grew up in the mean streets in Baltimore City. Man, very, very interesting. Like I was a guy that I grew up in the 80s and, really, growing up in the 80s in a single parent home, a lot of our misinformation came from the other friends in the neighborhood, the older friends that came up in that, it was when you look back at it, I think of only like 3 fathers in my whole entire community. It was literally, man, my next door neighbor. I had another friend that his father was there. He used to take us to basketball practice. And then I remember another father, he used to coach us in 13 under BNBL, which was like our youth basketball, neighborhood basketball league at that time in the city. And that was pretty much it. Even like getting through sports, I always played sports. And like even getting through sports, like from an intramural perspective, the street kind of got me early. I was a victim of urban society, for lack of a better term. And man, like I just didn't have the discipline to play sports because, at this time we were very, very mature, to say the least, in the 80s. Like, everybody just kind of wanted to rush it. And I always often joke, like, we kind of were growing in dog years in a sense. So I was like 15 going on 30, and yeah. A lot of decisions and a lot of things that I did, outside of school. And luckily, I'm an only child. I had a loving and praying mother that she would always get me like through school and always like, I never was a slacker in school. I was always good at school. So I just made poor decisions. I was a horrible decision maker at that time. But just peer pressure, things like that, growing up, in the city, it was a lot of things that we really had to contend with. So for me, I kind of went the whole gambit of man, childhood trauma and substance abuse, ended me in incarceration, and I tell people all the time, like my very first epiphany was inside the prison visiting room. And I remember growing up, my mother had a younger, she had a nephew, but they were kind of close because my mother was the youngest of 10, and her nephew were like closer to siblings. And I remember he was incarcerated, and we used to go see him. And I remember I was maybe like 6, 7, something like that. And I remember that visiting room in the Maryland State Penitentiary. And it looked the same way when I came up on the other side of the table as a prisoner back at 20 years later at 25. And that was my very first epiphany. And I was kind of like, you know what? As much as the inner city kind of propels you to these things, because when you're growing up in the 80s or, in the inner cities, you always wanted the rites of passage into manhood are very, very distorted. And what I mean by that, really like, being a man is all of these falsehoods. Like you got to learn how to fight. You got to learn how to get arrested. It's kind of like the mob movies and that movie Goodfellas. When Henry Hill first got arrested, like
threw a party.
They do a party. And like that's so true. Unfortunately, that's so true in those communities. And those microcosms of, inner city communities. And, really you wanted to kind of like get arrested so you wouldn't tell on your friends, and you wanted to go to jail or reform school or something like that, just to kind of show the world, show your friends you could hold your own and nothing happened to you. You could show, and you came home with a sense of street credibility. And, really, it's funny because my mom, we were talking about some things yesterday, and she was asking me, here's a mother's love, right? Like, I'm 54 years old. My mom was 81. And she says, I was a first generation college kid. And my mom said, well, hey, what about those, you really think you could get like, did you do anything with those credits like that, right? And I kept saying, yeah, I did, Mom. I said, I got my degrees. And she said, you did? And I'm like, yeah, I got a master's degree. And she was like, for real? And I'm like, yeah, from SSC University. And she just went, now my mom's 81. So she went round and round and round, like SSC University. Like, I never heard of that. I'm like, Streets and Corners University, Mom. I got the best degree you possibly could get in common sense in life.
Right.
So basically, that's the way I came up. And, really, after I was in for some years, and thing was, I just was, of course, when you look at substance abuse and, all those things, you're just, the only thing I was guilty of was just being a terrible decision maker. I never heard a bad idea when I was under the influence. And went in for some years, came home, and I mean, I just knew for me, like I could get sober or I could get clean if I just had enough time to stay clean. Because I was the guy that early, I was in and out, never used while I was in, and when I came home, it's like never wanted to use, but I never had any information. So while I was gone, I was very, very active in self-development, AA, NA, and really, I remember when people would come in to they call it the H&I commitment, when people they would bring the NA meetings or AA meetings in the institutions like hospitals and institutions. That's what H&I stands for. And I remember they used to tell us, ain't but two of y'all gonna make it. Ain't but two of you all gonna make it. And I always looked around the room and I'm like, I don't know who the other person is, but I know I'm one of them. And I mean, at this point, and I had tried like NA and everything while I was prior to being incarcerated. However, it was just like, sometimes you got to have those, you got to hit those bottoms in a sense. And I remember, man, like they used to tell us all the time, like when you get out, don't go home to get something to eat. Don't go get something to eat first. You go straight to a meeting. And like literally the way my life had just kind of played out, it was kind of like a higher power working the whole time. And I remember a good friend of mine was like, this was a guy, I was in the state system. Then I had to go to the county detention center to fill out the finish a suspended sentence, maybe like 5.5 months. And I was gone maybe like 2.5 years up until this point. So I had to do maybe another 5.5. And it was a guy that worked at the jail. And, we created a relationship, and he was in recovery. He was a staff member there. And this is just how funny, because I wrote the judge so many times, like, let me stay in the state. I don't want to go back to the county. And I just tried to do all this wordplay and wrote all these letters, Charlie, and he finally wrote me back like, you are going to BCDC, which is Baltimore County Detention Center. And I remember the day I got out, my man came and picked me up, and we went straight to a meeting. And man, I'm look nowadays, like I've been clean 28 years, but at that time, that was just my journey. So came home and and the funny thing, one of the things was an eye opener for me was I realized like how everybody else kind of prospered when I was gone, right? So it's like Jordan's mom, Tanya, and I, we weren't even, Jordan was nowhere even thought of at this point. But Jordan's mom, we were dating, and my mom, like I said, I was a single child, and it's like everybody prospered when I was gone. And that was another thing I looked at, like, wow, was I that much of a burden to people when I was home? And it's like, you got to get, the only way you can get clean, you got to come clean. And regardless of how painful it may be. And that was really my process early on. So when I came home, it was just like, you know what, I was laser focused and, my steps were very, very incremental. The main thing, as long as I stayed clean, that was my number one focus. And I remember having those, I talk about all this in my book, but I remember standing in the prison yard and, I would be with some guys and we were all like 25 to 26, we were young, and everybody had an agenda that was based around, I'm going to give it one more shot when I came home. I'm just going to do it better. And for me, it was like, no, my thing is, as long as I can stay clean, everything else will work out. And eventually, and it did. So, my big thing and my motivation for Jordan was just like, son, I already did everything negative. You can't do it any better than me. And if you want to do it, I can tell you how to do it. You know what I mean? And, your level of success, I've never seen anybody be successful doing this. And man, it was interesting because, I was that guy that when I came home, I was laser focused and, really, every time I was always a self-starter, own businesses all the time. And, I always had a license. I was selling insurance. I was selling something. And it's like, I always had to write this scarlet letter explaining because whenever that check the box came up, you got to explain. I just kept the same letter, Charlie. Like this is the letter that I use. But every time, like, anytime you were trying to get a state license for anything, whether it's to sell insurance, whatever it may have been, even I came in at home, I wanted to be an EMT. I took a class and I always had the mindset that if I could do a prison sentence, I could do anything. And that was always my thing. I'm the guy that took the real estate exam 7 times, like prison sentence probably was one of the hardest things I had to do in my life. So like everything else was an easy task at that point. And I came in, I came home, never looked back, and everything was incremental and job to one job, started a business, you name it, I kind of had it. I'm the guy that had a stack of business cards like this. And everything just kind of prepared me for what I was about to do. Your family looks at you to say, oh boy, what is he doing now? That ain't last until something sticks. And, many, many years later, everything was incremental. I would have success here, success there. And man, ironically, the thing that really stuck was a drug treatment facility. Of all the things that would have stuck, really, we had my partner and I had a really, really good run with mental health and substance abuse. And the interesting about me was, prior to this happening to Jordan, I was a really, really big reentry advocate. So our program was a nonprofit, and man, basically, we were dealing with a lot of, we created a space around housing lifers, and some lifers in Maryland had got some relief, and everybody that had did a minimum of, they were illegally sentenced to life, but the minimum amount of time was 44 years. The maximum amount of time was 51 years. So that right there, we had, got a grant to house maybe like 15 to 20 of these guys. And I mean, literally, I could have wrote a book on that because if it was 20 guys, it was 20 completely different situations on how people transition back into society. Those that didn't have support, those that had support. So for me, like I was a really, really big reentry advocate. Fast forward, and during this time, Jordan was born and, hey, I'm the trying to be a better dad than my dad was. And I just never wanted him to experience anything that I experienced because I was going to, the goal was to prevent him from. And, really when it came to like public speaking and stuff like that, I was a Toastmaster for years because it was always about self-development for me to be a better example for him. And I used to drag him along because I'm always been a competitive guy, right? And even with speeches and stuff like that, like I would drag him along and, and he's a kid and of course he don't want to go, but I'm still dragging him along because I always said like, son, you got to have this in your toolkit in life. one of the biggest fears about people is publicly speaking. So if you learn it early, it won't be, this. And Jordan was always, an athlete. And this was just a part of our process together. So, I never really thought I'd use it. And it's like ironic because when Jordan passed, I was already in the advocacy minds. I was already in the advocacy space. I was already a public speaker. Like I'd already had like a 10-year background, and I was a Toastmaster for 10 years. And, really, I was a part of a really good club where we had every ribbon and award you could possibly imagine. So when when I became president of that club, obviously you got to keep the momentum going, which is really kind of like, jokingly saying no pressure. But again, it was like a high level club, and, really learned a lot about that. So when Jordan passed, it was just like, really it was just, and the interesting thing, even when you guys look at podcasts now, I remember in 2017, I applied for this journalistic fellowship, right? And basically, it was a podcast. It was a podcast with the Soros Foundation and George Soros Foundation. And at that time, like I was still in the reentry space. So, that was like my big thing. I became a subject matter expert. And I didn't get the fellowship. However, I did start the podcast. And the name of the podcast was called the Restore My Dignity Project podcast. And basically, I just talked to everybody, other treatment facility owners, other people that are returning to the community, because it always boils down, like when people were successful, especially in reentry, was mental health, substance abuse, and housing are the three main things that will give a person a realistic, successful start. Because first of all, if I got a house, a roof over my head, if I don't have a roof over my head, now I'm in survival mode, and the other two things are going to fall off.
Sports are in full swing 24/7, which means athletes are bound to get injured. InjureFree is a software platform used by youth sports organizations and schools that was developed to help coaches, parents, and administrators communicate injuries that occur and ensure a safe return to play. These sports safety networks are essential for sports teams working to provide the safest possible environment for their families. For more information or to schedule a demo, please visit www.injurefree.com. That's www.injurefree.com.
And Marty, you've had experience before because you had jobs in sales and marketing, but you really worked a lot, like you said, with Mi Casa, Su Casa. And I think that was one thing that really possibly could have helped transition to what you do now with the foundation that you're working with. So is there anything from those prior roles that you were able to really take and you can use on a daily basis here at the Jordan McNair Foundation?
Yeah, man, all of them, actually, all of them. I mean, really just how to be the face of a company. I had a great team, but again, I was always the one that was in front. I was always the face of the company. So I was always the one that was out in the community creating relationships and things like that, partnerships and things in regards to the work that we did. So, I had a partner, I had a team. However, like I said, I was always the one out in the front. So I always understood sales. So people would always kind of, I would travel a lot. So whenever I would take my out the country hiatus, maybe once or twice a year from the company, they would always kind of shoot me emails like, nobody wants to deal with us because they only want to deal with you. But again, that's just because I knew how to create those relationships from a sales perspective, in a sense, because I always knew the value of, hey, referral sources and things like that. So even when you bring into the Jordan McNair, what I bring into the foundation is, you bring all your what not to do's into the foundation, and that's just business in general. You basically learn. It's a lot of learning curves in business. You're always learning, and it's like, okay, we could have did this better. Oh, we'll never do that again, but at least we tried it. So, like, basically, my whole business model at times comes from Mi Casa. And another thing we did was, one of the things, like even with college athletes, we created a consulting firm. And basically, it was called Mi Casa Behavioral Health Consultants. And what we did, we focused strictly on athletes. And basically, a lot of my business partner was a Nike rep. So he was like an AAU coach in Maryland. So he knew a ton of basketball coaches. But we had sold this concept but it was very reactionary. We were trying to sell it from a preventive perspective. With young kids, they're experimenting, and a lot of these kids, they're there for the summer. They may get caught smoking weed or something like that. And coach, trying to figure out, what do I do? Especially if you're dealing with a coach that doesn't know this generation or this culture in a sense. And we created a curriculum called Retrain the Brain. And basically we came in kind of like with a in your face substance abuse program, in your face substance abuse and life skills program. And basically one of the things that we used to focus on all the time with everybody was this paradoxical intervention concept, right? And those of us that may not, I know that's a big word, but let's think of, remember, Charlie, I think we may remember, maybe before our time, you know how like at home ec class, when you talked about families, they would give you the baby that you had to carry around.
Right.
And that's a paradoxical intervention.
Yep.
And it's like, do you really want to? So what we would do is we would give everybody our instant read urinalysis cup. And we basically like, look, hey, take this with you. I tell people all the time, when Jordan was going for, and Jordan was just a great guy, period. I kind of instilled some good advocacy, not enough to me in sports, but just life in general. And I remember when Jordan went to his, he chose Maryland, we chose Maryland, and we were going to his official visit. And I remember I'm like, look, his mom met us down there, and I kind of had that talk with him. I said, come by my house, we can ride together. And I said, look, son, really, this is going to be your first opportunity. I'm going to see what your decision-making process really looks like. I'm going to see if you're a leader or you're going to be a follower. And I'm like, here, go urinate in this cup. And he was like, what? I'm like, yeah, urinate in this cup. And I literally used that same paradoxical intervention. And I said, this is where, I said, I'm going to check it again Sunday, when we get back. And I said, really, if anything comes up in here positive, I'm going to take your car. I don't know how you're going to get to your trainer. I don't know how you're going to get to school. You got to go back to catching the bus to school. So at that time, really, this was the thing that he and I did in a sense, but that's what it was, the paradoxical intervention. And so we created that space around student athlete intervention, mental health, education, awareness, all these things. So for me, it basically, like, I never even kind of connected this stuff together until recently. I was filling out somebody proposed me to sit on this board, and they had this very, very lengthy application process. And when I was and I hadn't had a resume in years, I never needed one. I was a business owner. And when I was putting it together, I'm like, wow, like the advocacy, the collegiate student athlete education piece, like all of that really just kind of tied together, even to where we are now. And it was just like, wow, I never even thought about it like that, to see how these dots connected in a sense. So basically, that's what Marty McNair is. And, really, sorry to take you that way, Charlie, but look,
that's good. Hey, Marty, listen, first off, thank you. Appreciate you sharing that story. I mean, I don't think you get a chance to really understand or to know somebody and to get to know their story until you hear where they came from.
Yep.
And, and it's funny, you were talking about, making decisions, and I don't know too many 17, 18-year-old men out there who are sound of mind when they're making their decisions.
Correct.
I mean, you can fall into a lot of problems that way. But I mean, I think it's, like you said there, I mean, it's a path, it's a journey, and you're not quite sure where you're going to end up, but you do continue to find yourself in a position that you create. And, what you're interested in or what you believe in puts you in a position, and then you end up in those situations. And, it's never the path that you hope for, but when you get there, you make what you can from it. And it's we just have so much admiration for what you've done and for what your wife have done here with the Jordan McNair Foundation. I mean, I think it's just a wonderful piece that, you've taken such tragedy and you've turned it into something that can really affect a lot of lives for other people. And I think that's where, on those paths, I mean, talk a little bit about what you saw with Jordan growing up, what the youth sports world was, and then how you see it now. I mean, where along those lines do you look back and say, man, these are things that we should have had changed a long time ago, and and what we're working on today.
Hey, Charlie, and this is that may have been one of the better questions I've been asked recently. To me, I think it still looks the same. I just think that, and what I mean by that, Charlie, keep in mind, Jordan was a athlete literally since the time he was 6 years old, right? Mm-hmm. I've had him involved flag football. That he didn't play tackle, but he went right into baseball, basketball. We found his niche in basketball, okay, and then we played basketball all the way through until he started playing football. Because Jordan didn't even play football until he was like 13 again.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing, man, and this is what we do as an organization, we educate, and unfortunately it still looks the same, but I think now we're in the fortunate part is we're in a position now really to carry this mission and emphasize the added value of education. So for us, man, Jordan was man, he literally everywhere we took Jordan. I mean, I took Jordan, right? Tanya and I, basketball and AAU games, all this stuff, him growing up. And one thing that was always consistent was even at the AAU games, at basketball games, wherever, football clinics, football camps, football combines, you name it, Jordan, we've been to at least 100 of those in his career, right? There was always one thing that was consistent. There was no education. All I ever did was sit in the stands, Charlie. I never knew if a piece of safety equipment had fell out of the sky and hit me in my head, I wouldn't have known what it was because nobody, regardless, the Nikes, the Under Armours, the Adidas, the Army All-American game. I remember I took Jordan there. All I ever did was sit in the stands and watch him compete. That was the one thing that's consistent, and I think that's still consistent now. However, what I notice is everybody that I've talked to up until this point in regards to, hey, let us come in and do a parent education session. Let us do a coach's education session. Let's do a student athlete self-advocacy and safety education. Everybody's receptive to it now. But when we were coming along, man, never ever. I mean, all I've ever did was sit in the stands. And like I said, I didn't know what a first aid tent was. I didn't know what athletic trainer, who an athletic trainer, much less what an athletic trainer was. You know, the interesting thing, and not to deviate from your questioning, but I remember when Jordan got injured and we walked into the ER, right? I didn't even know I don't even know the magnitude of who I'm asking what to and who they are. I asked Wes Robinson and another guy, they were the athletic trainers. I'm asking them, hey, what happened? I didn't ask them what happened. I asked them, hey, had this ever happened to either of you on your shifts before? Because I still don't know the magnitude of what's going on. This was the very first question I asked. I'm asking it of the athletic trainers. I don't know who the athletic trainers are. Jordan went to a high school where they had resources. You got 20-something thousand high schools in the United States, and they fall into two pockets. Those who have resources, those who don't have resources. And when you look at resources, you mean like they can afford an AT or something like that.
Yeah.
To a high school he went to a kind of a private school with resources out the yang, but nobody as a parent. And I think that's something that all parents should know, or schools should know, that who's the athletic trainer, what's their role, and this is the person that can potentially, more than likely, will save your kid's life. And that's the thing that, like, to me was always kind of consistent. Whereas though we're working on these things now, like I said, I never even knew who an athletic trainer was or the value of one or the significance until this happened.
Yeah. And you talk about the disparity too. I mean, this isn't just something that happens in sports, right? That's a healthcare disparity in that you have the haves and the has-nots, right?
Sure. Yep.
And that's where I think that this is such an important topic because, you know, we frame this stuff around our athletes, but there's a good portion of kids, I think 2/3 of our kids in our country are playing sports every year.
Yep.
And, you know, and it is a matter of how do we get these types of resources to everyone? How do we break down those barriers and make sure that it doesn't matter where you're living, you've got access to a positive environment in sports? You know, you can stay healthy and active and physically fit and, you know, help with some of those mental health, get you off the streets, make sure you're not getting into trouble, right?
Exactly.
But at the same time, when you are injured, because if you're playing sports, it's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
You know, and, you know, there's a process and there's a way for the parents to be educated about how we take care of those children and how we get them back into what they're doing and what they love, right?
Yep,
And that's
totally
the mission. Yeah,
yep,
love that.
totally agree. Yep.
So, Marty, I guess one thing that I really wanted to bring up is that at the time when everything went down with Jordan, there was a big media circuit that you and your wife Tanya went on, and essentially you guys really went around the idea that there was the toxic environment and toxic culture, just one within Maryland's, you know, rankings as far as how they ran practices, the ways that the coaches handled things. I've experienced myself, you know, coaches that are great, very supportive, they want the best out of you, and they're going to do that through positivity. I've had coaches that will go and yell at you to the end of the earth to try and get the best out of you. I don't know, have you maybe seen anything within at least college or specifically possibly, you know, since then, Maryland's program of having a systemic change of a toxic culture, realizing that it's not about yelling at your players or pushing them to the brink to get the best out of them?
Yeah. So another good question. So in that one, Justin, you got to realize, man, that's the hardest part about advocacy is changing the mindset, right? Now, when you look at a toxic environment at that particular time at Maryland, right? Now, when you look at, I still come along from the perspective, and I talked about learning curves in business. There's a lot of learning curves in parenting. I never thought to ask Jordan, hey, is everything okay? And he may have said something, he may not, because this is what I think. So when Jordan went down, a lot of the older kids that were on the team prior to that coaching staff coming in there, right? A lot of them, and no matter, I think what people fail to realize, regardless of their size, Jordan was 6'5", if they're 6'6", 6'10", whatever the case may be, an 18 or a 19-year-old is still an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old. They don't,
Absolutely.
Charlie just said, you don't process the way we process. You're still, regardless of your size, you're still a baby, a young person at heart and mentally as well. So a lot of the parents were calling me, a few parents, and they were saying that when the new coaching staff took over, their sons were calling home crying, like, you know what, I can't take it. These guys are this, they're that. And what do? I'll tough it out, shake it off, and again, until something happens, now this is where we are. Now, do I in regards to a toxic culture, and it's interesting because I was reading Wikipedia on us the other day, and they just went through the whole process and everything that happened, really just up until that point. Now, depends on, to me, I think that when you talk about culture, and we always say at the Jordan McNair Foundation, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And this is whatever sport. But when it comes to coaching kids, you have to let kids know, like, you got to create the kids that I was at. I'm 54 when I was, and a coach could yell at you. They could do this, they could do that, deny water breaks and play all these mental games that so many coaches play. That was, who did you really have to advocate for you back then? Because look, the difference, Charlie, with me, my mom wasn't coming to those games. Look, the only time mom came when they signed you up, and I found it's funny. I found my mom always gives me, like, she's a collector of things, so she always gives me the occasional envelope of just a bunch of mementos, and it had my 8-10 basketball registration ID, right? So, and the registration fee was $10 back then.
Hanging on to this thing for 40 years.
Exactly. That's my mom. So I still got it. Right. She's just that type of mom. But when you look at the generations where, we just think that, I think as parents, we make kids coachable. And this is part of our parent education. Gone are the days, we don't do the parents parent and coaches coach type thing. Because what do? We think same thing I did. I asked 2 questions while the coaches were sitting at the kitchen table 3 days before signing day. Can he get some playing time? And what's your support around mental health and substance abuse? Because who knows, I might have been angling for my, another position or some more business. But that was all I asked, Charlie. And when you look at that type of behavior, coaches get that from somewhere else. So you got to look, that's a long line of that head coach at that time. And I don't really, acknowledge him to that degree, but that head coach, he had worked under Urban Meyer. He had worked under 4 or 5 other coaches already. So a lot of that behavior is learned behavior when you look at that toxic culture. So the point I was making about the kids was the older kids knew that it was a shift from the old coach to these new guys. Jordan's class didn't. So it's kind of, I don't like to use this analogy, but it's kind of like if a young lady, her first boyfriend is abusive, she may think that this is the way all men are supposed to treat you, versus, hey, her first boyfriend wasn't abusive, and her second boyfriend became abusive. And it's like, wait a minute, something ain't right about that. So I think when Jordan's class came in, really they just they didn't know, they didn't have a measuring stick to say, wait a minute, this ain't right. And of course, you're not going to ask, hey, you assume that your kid can kind of advocate for themselves. So when all of the toxic behavior came out, it was like, well, damn, why ain't nobody say nothing? But did somebody really even ask either,
Not many youth sports administrators began their careers with the dream of negotiating insurance rates. Most have a love and passion for the game and saw it as a way to inspire the next generation of youth athletes. However, nowadays, insurance can be the single greatest cost for a youth sports organization. At American Sports Insurance Services, we've done the work for you and created the single most comprehensive youth sports insurance program on the market. We did it by aggregating the largest youth sports injury database in the world. Let us do the heavy lifting and represent you for all your risk management needs. For more information or to get a quote, visit www.getamsis.com. That's www.getamsis.com.
Yeah, and it's the advocacy side there that I think you really hit the nail on the head with. I mean, we know now, looking back, we can say as adults, hey, this was right, that was wrong.
Exactly.
And we can say, okay, there's a better way to do that. But that's what I think was missing right now is that, well, certainly 10, 15, 20 years ago, there wasn't any advocacy, but nowadays there's, that's where we can make this difference, is that the adults that know better can step up, can start to advocate for children. Because like you said, they don't know if it's right or wrong. They just, this is the first time they ever played sports, or maybe it's the first time with this coach, whatever it may be.
Or at that level.
Those transitions. Or at that level. Yeah, that's a great point. This is what college football is all about. This is how it's going to get played, right?
Exactly. And Charlie, I think that and the interesting thing, even, we've had such a shift in the world lately. And even I think with Black Lives Matters, recently you had a lot of student athletes that, like that awareness, Charlie, like you said, you started to look back and so in essence, a lot of players were like, wait a minute, coach was kind of saying some stuff that, because, older, a lot of little snide remarks. And we're now, kids are a lot more educated along the way. Of course, you got the internet. So, YouTube and Instagram. So you got so many different
media channels.
Influences really to kind of confer with, in a sense. So I think now, really you look at young people they know a lot of their value. You look at the transfer portal, you're looking at NIL and all these things now where it's like, the playing field is kind of even. And the interesting thing about young people, especially at the collegiate level, there are three things. They're impulsive, they're erratic, and they're irrational. Meaning, guess what, Charlie, you the coach, you do something I don't like, man, the heck with you, I'm going in the transfer portal. And more than likely, most of them, kids always come in. I think kids always fall into three categories. To me, kids fall into, you got your leaders, you got your followers, and you got your cool kids. And the cool kids are the ones that seem cool right now. Of course, their lifespan doesn't last that long, career-wise.
Right.
But the ones in the middle, they're going to follow somebody. So guess what? If a kid's sitting here and they're saying, Coach, I'm leaving, man, you might have 4 or 5 his or her teammates. They may jump in the portal with them.
Yeah. That brings up a really, really great thing, is because the coaches, when Jordan was having that practice with the heat stroke, the coaches didn't pay the most attention. It was actually his teammates that were really, again, advocating for him. There were teammates that have been reported saying that he did not look okay, that when they were doing those 110-yard sprints, that he had to be carried for the last sprint. Even that the coaches had this mindset of just drag him. They didn't care that he wasn't in a state of, prosperity or well-being in that moment, that he really needed assistance. Some coaches since have decided to change their mindset. One of the biggest shifts, I don't know if you are aware, is that even in the Army and Marines, they've really gone away from the drill sergeant mentality of yelling at you and trying to strip you down of your identity to make you and rebuild you into what they need. I think similarly in football for college, that kind of trend has started. Have you seen that with what you are doing at the Jordan McNair Foundation, that there is a change in the way that people are conducting business in sports?
Yeah, absolutely. And even to answer your earlier question, Maryland is an example program to me where they do things right. We're very connected. We work with the University of Maryland. Coach Locks and I really, we're like brothers. We don't even have a football relationship, but of course, I remember when, I called Locks and I was like, bro, you should come back. And he was like, we decided that, hey, let's do this together. And, really my book could have went a couple different ways. I could have tore Maryland down, or, we could have looked at a longer term relationship where we could make a bigger impact. And that was really one of the things that, we did. But when you talk about these things, really that particular time, and it's funny because this is how this whole process works. So the athletic trainer at the time was Wes Robinson, right? And Wes, now this is the thing. So keep in mind, when you have these type of incidents, you're going to have three different versions of what happened. You're going to have an emotional teammates version, or how it looked to them what happened. Okay. Then you're going to have the investigative version of what happened, right? Then you're going to have the truth of what happened. So at that time, I was, I feel like as a parent, anytime somebody hurts your child, all bets are off. Like, really, like, it's a lot of emotional maturity and emotional restraint really to get this, to try to get some answers or not act out. So I remember I heard a friend of mine that told me Jordan's teammates from high school, they text the coach that evening and was like, oh, this ain't what happened. And an emotional rant of what happened to my teammate. So this is what I'm locked on. And I'm hearing that, Wes said, hey, you know what? If he can't walk, drag his ass across the field. And that's all I see. So I remember Wes came in to view the body, and I grabbed Wes and I'm threatened him. And I'm like, bro, I'm the last person you'd ever want to see in life. The investigation came out. You had a redacted version. I never really saw I just saw the redacted version. So fast forward 3.5 years later, the restorative forgiveness concept comes into play. Wes reached out to Tanya. My faith had changed. I'm Muslim at the time. I'm Muslim now. So who am I? I'm asking for forgiveness 5 times a day. Who am I not to forgive it? And my content, it looked bigger at this point. Like, really like it looked different where, okay, this was God's plan. Ain't nobody's ever going to willingly participate to say, hey, I'm participating in this. So we sat down and, like I said, we kind of sat in the forgiveness space, and we sat with Wes, and now I'm asking questions. And I'm like, bro, we forgive you. This wasn't your fault. But now I'm asking questions. What happened? I got 105. What happened? We never practiced the emergency action plan. Bottom line. Anything that could have happened that day, Charlie, happened. Murphy's Law was in full effect. It was construction on this campus. So the EMTs went to another location before they got there, and we already know that time is steady ticking. You missed the window of opportunity to cool down. So now central nervous dysfunction is kicking in. So now here's a 6'5" guy, and he's acting out. So Wes and I know he wouldn't mind me saying this, but I'm asking him. He said, I know you heard what I said. Did I use the right choice of words? No. However, I'm out here I got 105 kids, student athletes out here. I got 2 athletic interns. I'm yelling at them so they won't let them cramp up. See how it kind of changes from the 3 different versions of it?
Absolutely.
So now I can process it from facts now versus emotions. So when we're looking at that, it's like, okay. The bottom line, when you look at all the deaths across the nation, and it's sad that you see them, and it always boils down, the common denominator is always the EAP. Were they prepared? Did they practice it? Did they have one? It always boils down to the EAP. Bottom line.
And that's, Marty, your point there too is that this is risk management in a nutshell. It's one of those things. It's like we never think about it, and like, oh, well, it's never going to happen. But then you're in that moment where all hell's breaking loose, and we don't know what to do. It's panic, and it's not organized, and those seconds are the difference.
Exactly. Charlie, I got a call from a coach the other day, and what's this? May have been this week, and he was telling me that it may have been Sunday. They had an umpire that died. He had a cardiac arrest while he was officiating the game. Nobody knew what an AED machine, and they were at a school. And he was obviously, it happened like a few days prior, but he passed, I think that's maybe Saturday. Now you want to talk about training.
Yeah, exactly right.
And the thing is, Charlie, you still need it, but you still need it even from a reaction perspective. But
I just can't do. I mean, it's one of. I'm at that point right now where it's like we don't. How many more cases do you need? You know, I mean, you just gotta put this mindset. I mean, it goes back to safety first, right? I mean, and you know, any of the lives, it doesn't matter where it is, it doesn't matter who it is, but especially for the kids.
yeah,
I mean, if we're in these scenarios and we don't have this stuff taken care of, and you're right though, how many of them out there right now don't have an AEP, haven't practiced it in 2, 3, maybe ever, years, and don't know where an AED is. Hopefully they have one on campus, but they just don't know.
yeah,
And, they're out here. And I think, we've been talking about a lot of this stuff too. It almost feels like it's the shift away from looking at athletes as a commodity. We've got to see everything as human beings. And then when we're there, then the mindset's a bit different. But in the athletic world, it's their commodities, and we don't value the individual in that sense. And so we overlook these things, and it's just, disposable in a way almost. And it's just, that's a mindset I think is shifting away. I think folks realize now they have to think this way. They have to be, if they're going to be successful. To your point, the kids are more educated, the families are more educated. We're looking and asking for questions now on our programs. What is the safety plan? How do you treat your athletes? And word gets around too, right? I mean, coaches will have a reputation, and you'll talk to a few other families, and you'll hear, I don't know about that one, versus the people who treat their kids the right way. And it's a big difference.
Totally agree. I think now, Charlie, when you look at, but again, this is the main thing. Like you said, from a commodity perspective. So, and man, let me tell you, like Charlie, you and I, we speak the same language in a sense. And when you look at everybody kind of talks student athlete education, right? And it's almost like we're talking over the kids' heads. Are we talking to, even when we talk to them, but like, are we really talking to them? Because I'm gonna give you a prime example. I was at a school in Philadelphia, a high school in Philadelphia a couple months ago. 300 kids, only one kid knew where the AED machine was at. 1 out of 300. I was at another school last summer, and it was some, and every time we would, because a lot of times, really, Charlie, legislation is key. But the thing is, when you talk about legislation, right, when you look at certain words are very, very significant in legislation. Mandated versus recommended.
Right.
Mandated means, look, all this has to be done. There has to be consequent, because it's always going to boil down, even when you look at legislation, who's policing the legislation? What are the consequences of legislation of this event if you're not held accountable to do what you need to do to enforce this law? So when you look at those things, like verbiage is very, very significant. Recommendations versus mandated, big difference. So a lot of times, really, the more and more educated we are, and when you look at parents, I'm a firm believer, like, community is our superpower. And with parents, we can get so, I don't even know where this comes from, man, but we can buy into that concept, because I've talked to parents all the time, and it's like, you could tell an AAU kid from a high schooler, and as soon as they get to high school, it's like, oh no, I don't want to say nothing to coach, because I don't want to I don't want to cut my son or daughter's plan if I'm a problem. But look, guess what? If something happens to your kid, last thing you want to hear coach give you a philosophical answer on what happened to your child. So I think that really the onus falls on the parent as well, because you can't send your child into an environment that's unsafe for them, or you send your child in a situation that they're not prepared. Charlie, I got a friend, and Justin, I got a friend of mine. He was a baseball player, right? And he's a little older, and he was saying that his mom, some recruiters came to him early on, and they recruited him for college, and his mom said, no, he'll be dead in a week if I let him go away from here. Like, he just didn't have those skills in the sense, but his mom knew that. You see my point?
Right.
So again, I think that as parents, you have to prepare your child to go into these environments, in a sense. So even when it comes to sports and things like that, we have to prepare our young people, and we just can't say, oh, coach, you got it, and expect coaching them, because they people too. I think, Charlie, the more information everybody has, when you start talking about people that are deficient in resources and things like that, parents may have to know, like, nah, it's going to take a village on this one, or it's going to take the community impact to really keep all of these kids safe.
Well, and that's it, right? The community aspect of it, it's everybody advocating for the same things. And but
Yeah,
number
exactly.
one, parents on kids, right? You got to advocate for your child. You got to teach them to advocate for themselves.
Totally agree.
And then but if we have that mindset as a group, you know, we can move forward with it. Hi, my name is Charlie Wund, and I'm the CEO and founder of the Agency for Student Health Research. When I started the company over a decade ago, I aimed to help reduce injuries within youth sports. Since then, InjureFree was created as a risk management software platform and has grown to become one of the leading injury reporting platforms used by thousands of athletic organizations and schools nationwide. Our expansive education library and reporting technology provides the tools administrators need to take the pain out of risk management. As a former high school athletic director and youth sports organizer, I understand the regulatory compliance requirements and need for individual accountability. Our goal is to provide a service that does better than checking the box. For more information or to schedule a demo, please visit www.injurefree.com. That's www.injurefree.com. Talk about your HB 836 and your legislation. I mean, I know that's a big piece of what you're doing with the foundation. You know, and that's affecting the changes that, you know, from the top down philosophy. Talk about your experiences there and then ultimately your goals.
Yeah, man. So for us, you know, really, I tell people all the time, like, Charlie, I consider myself to be a lay legislative liaison, right? And I didn't even know that was a legitimate title, but it is. And the interesting thing for us is when you look at legislation, that was like our process was very incremental. We're going in our 5th year next month, actually. And man, I thought it was about donating to cold water tubs. And then I thought it was talking about this, just talking about prevention and safety and all that. But what was going to make anything I said stick? So for me, I thought that our first bill, I knew when Jordan passed, I was like, you know, it would be great to get one law in his name. I never thought that we'd be working on 4 successful ones, or we'd had 4 successful ones passed. I was the guy that all I knew about legislation was Schoolhouse Rock. You know, I'm only a bill. I'm sitting here on Captain Justin. I don't even know if you were old enough to remember that, but
believe me, I remember Schoolhouse Rock 100%.
Yeah, man. So I'm only a bill. I'm just a bill. I'm only a bill. I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. So I didn't know anything about how to get a bill passed. So as we kind of moved on and we got one pass, we got another pass, we got a third pass. So now after the third one, now I know how to maneuver a little bit now. I know how to play politics. So I'm learning. And House Bill 836 for us was in the state of Maryland is the emergency action plan has to be practiced twice a year. Well, when we submitted it, we wanted it practiced every quarter, right? But of course, you know, that's always a give and take thing at a legislative level. Now, for that, what that means is the EAP has to be practiced twice a year, once before every spring season, once before every fall season at all Maryland public high schools and middle schools in the state of Maryland. Now, what it also does, it requires that all safety equipment is practiced, and you look at AD machines have to be within 2 to 3 minutes reach. You got to have your wet bulb globe thermometers. You got to have your cold water tubs. You know, your staff needs to be CPR certified. They need to be trained in all of these things throughout the state, which is an excellent template. And this is the thing, let me back up, because I don't want anybody to have the impression that I'm just this wonder lay legislative liaison guy. I can tell the people that the laws affect how to get laws established. What's the process? So that's where the lay comes in at. However, that particular bill is ideal because it mandates that these things are done, practice every fall, every spring and every fall season. The safety equipment has to be there, right? And this is significant because, like I said, I'm not this legislative genius around these things. This was a law that got passed by another family, however, in Florida. However, the only thing was it wasn't mandated, it was recommended. So see that verbiage and how impactful verbiage is when it comes to bills. It was a young man that passed that October, right while we were in legislation. He was a football player, took a hit. I don't know if he had a spinal cord or a brain injury, and unfortunately nobody identified it. which you can't blame. And this is the thing, you can't blame people for what they don't know. However, they had practiced twice a year, so that's when this bill went into effect. And man, that may be one of our more impactful bills to me, because that's the one that keeps kids most safe. Even when you look at, we got an NIL bill, name, image, and likeness bill, but to me, the safety aspect is these EAPs, mandating that the EAPs are practice and things like that. And most importantly, less mandating that the safety equipment to save a life is within that 2 to 3 minutes reach, 3 to 5 minutes reach, because that's really going to make all the difference in the world when it comes to saving a student athlete's lives.
And Marty, I mean, heat stroke is, like you said, it's a very common injury. Most people don't think that it happens that often. Majority of times, no, it does not really result in hospitalization. But what are the steps that you can advocate to others, just that once you see signs of heat stroke, what are the first few things you should be looking for and try and do to take action?
Yeah, so hey, Justin, let me explain what a heat stroke is, first of all, right? So when you, and again, here's that lay explanation of it. When your core body temperature reaches 104 degrees or goes above 104 degrees, that's the equivalent of putting your body in a microwave oven, right? We put food in a microwave to do what? Cook. You have a 20 to 30-minute window to cool that person's core body temperature down, whether it's submersion in the ice cold tub and ice bath, whether you put them in a tarp, whether you put cold towels on their neck. But the interesting thing, that's heat stroke. The main thing is we got to identify the signs and symptoms of heat exhaustion prior to getting heat stroke. So nobody just has heat stroke. It starts with heat exhaustion. So the first sign of heat exhaustion is cramps. First sign right there. Dizziness, lightheadedness, nausea, some mentally altered status. That's when we really, and those are usually the signs that are ignored at that time. By the time Jordan, and you basically have what we say in the space of heat-related injuries, cool first, transport second. So those are my parents out there. Remember when we were growing up, basically we had Smokey the Bear, stop, drop, and roll in the event of a fire. When it comes to heat stroke, cool first, transport second, meaning put that person in a cool process, start the icing down, put them in a cold water tub, then call 911 first, then call 911. So the main thing, we got to identify what to do first, what it is. Now, the interesting thing, people always assume I was the same way. Oh man, you weren't hydrated. You weren't this, you weren't that. Jordan wasn't hydrated. Jordan was this and that. Yeah, at the end of the day, whenever a person does repeat sprints, meaning you're doing the same thing over and over and over again at a high velocity, when it comes to outdoor activity, you have the potential for your body to overheat. When does it usually happen? It usually happens with your larger athletes, your linemen, your things like that. But it also happens with runners, triathletes, things like that. Because again, these are elite athletes. You can just be a person that you can be in the zone that day and you can overheat. So it can happen to anybody. Heat-related injuries aren't a bad thing. However, when they're mismanaged, that's when they become tragic. You got 20 to 30 minutes to cool a person down. And literally, if you don't, the damage becomes irreparable at that point. I.e., in our scenario, Jordan woke up a healthy kid Tuesday morning. We had an emergency liver transplant Friday morning, less than 72 hours later, with 85% of his liver being in necrosis, meaning dead, for those who don't know what necrosis means. And with that, and what happened was they missed the window of opportunity. They didn't get Jordan to the ER to an hour and 36 minutes later with a core body temperature of 106 degrees. Mm-hmm. I.e., you killed his liver right there on the spot. It was liver cooked that whole time. So I think the main thing is to identify what the actual process or what the actual injury is first. And for me, I always thought I just always thought when we first started, when Jordan first got injured, like, oh, he had a heat stroke. I just thought you got in the shade and drank some cold water, and that was pretty much it. Yeah, that's heat exhaustion. However, I had no idea of how tragic heat stroke could be. And, really like all that was a new education for me.
Marty, I think we appreciate it. I mean, I always used to say, it's not necessarily what you're learning and how much you're going to retain because of the subject. It's more important about who's teaching it.
Correct.
And, I think one thing that comes clear now is that, your passion, your path, your history to get you to this point, your unfortunate circumstances that have, put you in this position, but you're doing a great job of affecting change, not only for the kids in Maryland, but, on a countrywide. I think this is the example that needs to be set of how we communicate with parents, how we educate. We teach them to be advocates for their children, teach them to advocate for their children to advocate for themselves, but really, educate as much as we can and breaking it down as simply as we can. Because, this isn't, our brains are full of all kinds of crazy stuff, that killer pop song from the 80s, I can't get out of my head, but this is the stuff that you need to be able to pull and recall in these moments. And it is life-changing, and it can be life-saving. So we appreciate the work that you guys are doing out there. And we look forward to being able to work with you guys down the road as well.
Man,
I'm
looking
excited
forward
about it.
to it. The interesting thing, man, that, obviously my mindset was always, as we come up on the 5th year of Jordan's passing, really, man, like I'm the guy that, like, none of this is guaranteed. Like, really, I'm my glass is always half full, man. So, like, even in Jordan's 19 years, those 2 years that he was fighting for his life in the hospital, man, literally were like the worst 2 weeks of his life to us. And for me, man, like, I felt confident that, I got Father of the Year award for 19 years straight. You know what I mean? And to me, I really couldn't go off of, the loss of a child. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but just from a grief or a grieving process or a therapeutic process, I was more grateful for what I had in 19 years versus, which wasn't what could have been promised. It wasn't no guarantee I would have got this, or it wasn't no guarantees or anything other than, what I had right there, man. And, I'm a firm believer. I had an older family member tell me that, hey, children are gifts from God, and sometimes we got to return them, before we want to. But, as long as you did the right thing with them while you did have them, that's really the main thing. And I know a lot of parents, I deal with a lot of parents that lost children, man. And sometimes, they subscribe to that, and sometimes maybe they don't, but that's just always what kind of helps me get through.
No, it's amazing.
I thought Jordan would have been, I thought I get emotional around draft time, like, because I could see that father, son, and man, I could feel it, so. But again, in my mind, me thinking he was special, meaning he could play on Sundays, I never thought that he'd be the poster boy for student athlete safety on a national platform at all. So, like, it was, like they say, you make God laugh, tell him what your plans are, and and chuckle out of that, right?
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you one thing we always like to ask before we sign off with everybody is, we talked a lot about a lot of different topics.
Sure.
But from you and your seat right now, if you could snap your fingers and change the world, what would you like to see in that change? What would that be, that thing that overnight you could have something and it would be immediately changed throughout the country? Or let's just, globally is fine too.
To me, what I'd like to see is the space that we're all in. If we can all grasp that ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure mindset when it comes to our student athletes. And the last thing we need is another foundation in a dead student athlete's name. That's the last thing we need. And I just think if we can all grasp that preventive mindset, I think that would make a big difference in the world.
Yeah. Well, here's hoping you're the last one, I mean, I think that's the goal.
Yeah.
It's one of those things.
That's the goal. Yeah.
Always said, I'd love to be put out of a job. Meaning sports safety is the way it's supposed to be, and there's no issues across the board. That's the goal here. So
yeah, totally agree, for sure.
Marty, we appreciate you, man. We appreciate your time. Man. We appreciate your journey, your story, sharing it with everybody. And we, like I said, continue to look forward to our relationship.
Hey, Charlie, thank you, man. Looking forward to it for sure. You guys take care. All right.
We would like to thank you all for listening to today's episode of the Safety Goals podcast, presented by InjureFree. I'm your host, Justin Torres. And a big thanks to our special guest. And also, thanks to my co-host, Charlie Wund. To listen to other episodes of the Safety Goals podcast, check us out on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.